I'm John Marshall, and I'm here today to discuss with an old friend, Dave Mader, who's been a shared services leader for many more years than perhaps he or I would like to admit. But we'd like to ask Dave to share some of his reflections on the eGov Act and the experience we've had implementing shared services since 2002. So Dave, thanks for joining us today. If you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit about yourself. What are you doing currently, and where were you when the eGov Act was enacted, and what have you what's been your role throughout its implementation?
Thank you, John, and it's a good opportunity to talk about a topic, as you mentioned, that's been sort of near and dear to my heart for many decades now, and that's, how do we improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the federal government. Currently, I am serving as the strategy officer for the civilian sector of Deloitte Federal Consulting. But prior to joining Deloitte, I was the OMB controller and also acting DDM in the last 2.5 years of the Obama administration from 2014 to 2017. But before that, did some other consulting work, but I really got involved in shared services and all of the things that are covered by the E-Government Act when I was the former IRS Assistant Deputy Commissioner at the IRS. And what was interesting about the time that I served in that role, and this was the early 90s through the time I retired in 2003, is we were actually spearheading, a lot of the initiatives that the act, when it was passed and signed by President Bush in 2002, reinforced and validated things that we were doing within the IRS, because I do think at that time we were sort of leading the federal government in a lot of these areas. In particular, in 1994, we did a study, the Resource Management Strategy Study, which basically looked at how is the IRS in the future going to deliver back office operations, finance, HR, IT, procurement, because the structure had delivery in like 130 some odd different locations around the country. That study actually became the basis of the IRS then moving to a centralized shared service organization. At the same time, we were also experimenting with this in the early 90s with this emerging technology called the internet. And we started to explore the use of the internet for direct filing of tax returns. That took a number of years, but it really took off after the Restructuring and Reform Act in 1998. And today there's, I guess, every year 130 million individuals file electronically. Prior to that e-filing, though, we actually did something really creative called telefile. For those of us who are old enough to remember the touch-tone telephones, we actually created a system using the touch-tone telephone where individuals who filed a very simple return, like a 1040 EZ, could actually file their return over the telephone line in a secure fashion. At the same time, we were also looking at how to better use ERP systems that were readily available in the commercial space, but not yet fully embraced at the federal level. And during, again, those mid to late 1990s, we implemented core financials using SAP. We implemented core HR using PeopleSoft. In fact, we were the first federal agency to use PeopleSoft. So when the E-Government Act was passed and signed, it was a validation, because when you look at what those key elements of the act are, we were starting to address them. Better customer experience, interagency collaboration, reducing cost, better decision-making, and, transforming agency operations. Those were, to me, foundational in the 2002 Act, and has basically served as, a foundation over the next 20 years for continuous improvement by multiple organizations and from administration to administration, regardless of party.
Yeah, those are great points, Dave. We're hearing this from some of our other testimonies that the eGov Act did, as you say, it validated and codified and accelerated some of the progress that was already underway in many of the same areas. As you reflect back to the early years of implementation, the Bush administration, what stands out in your memory of the accomplishments and challenges, and what are your observations of that early progress?
Well, as I mentioned, John, I think the act really did sort of set the foundation for the federal government in thinking about how can the federal government leverage, the emerging, it's no longer emerging, but what at the time, the emerging technology to improve the efficiency and effectiveness, of agencies and improve the service and mission delivery. I think what's interesting is when you think about, the George W. Bush administration, you think about, this act, but I think it actually reinforced the push by the Bush administration around PART, in which they set goals for organizations on how to improve performance. And clearly technology was emerging as one of those foundational elements. So I think the combination of moving thinking to, to ERPs and to e-government, and at the same time, setting up goals and expectations and holding agencies accountable for performance, which I think is critical for the government in order to continue to make progress.
Yeah, that's a great observation too, Dave, that the Bush PMA did have, I think, 5 initiatives that were pretty tightly integrated, and it was all about performance, and the PART being the tool that measured the performance and the outcomes from the eGov and the human capital initiatives and the other elements of that agenda. So it was pretty well conceived. Dave, you've been, let's fast forward and get a little bit more into shared services. Now, you were a controller at OMB, and you were the designated shared services policy officer during your tenure at OMB, and you really picked up the pace and did a lot to institutionalize the drive forward in shared services. So many of us feel very, very grateful and indebted to you for your service in those years. What stands out from your memory of the Obama administration and into the Trump administration of the progress? What were some of the key milestones that you can observe? And did you see a connection back to the eGov Act that might have enabled some of that progress to happen?
Yeah, as I mentioned, John, I think one of the things that we should feel good about is sort of the journey that we've been on. Now, I will say that I think the journey should be accelerated and we should have been moving a little bit faster, but this is a large bureaucracy to move, and it's very decentralized when you think about when you think about CFO Act agencies, the 24 of them, they're all headed by secretaries and administrators, and they're pretty independent. So getting the mass of those agencies to move forward, I think, is a challenge. But the eGov Act set that foundation for using technology to improve performance. When Danny Werfel, who was my successor as controller, he actually did some really good things in OMB with setting standards, beginning to set standards for particularly financial management systems. When I came in 2014, it was basically, let's build on what Danny was doing, and let's come up with a governance model. Let's come up with the policy officer position, and let's start moving towards more aggressive goals with deadlines and timeframes to move there. And I think, to the credit of the Trump administration and people like Beth Angerman and Earl Pinto, who's there now, they continued that momentum. The establishment of the QSMOs, I think, was a logical progression to some of the work that I was doing when I was at OMB. And we look now at where the QSMOs are, and, we already now have, in finance, a new contract that is open for vendors to move core financials to the cloud. So when I look back on 20 years, it's significant, the progress that we've made. And, as I mentioned, I think going forward for the Biden administration and future administrations, I think we actually need to take note of what the Bush administration did with setting very specific goals for agencies to improve their performance using technology and to have reporting and transparency in their accomplishments.
Yeah, that's another great observation, Dave. Now, looking back 20 years as we're doing, what stands out in your mind as the most important lessons learned and the unfinished business from the last 20 years? What do you think has worked well? What hasn't worked so well? And what next steps do you see necessary? You mentioned the performance goals and measurement. What other elements do you think are needed to accelerate shared services more rapidly?
I think more concrete plans on how we're going to take what has been accomplished over 20 years and move it forward. And I say that, John, because when you and I interact in our private lives, the seamlessness of transactions, the responsiveness to, the consumer needs, candidly are far superior to what citizens get from their government. There's progress being made, but it's not because the technology is not there. I think it's not because of, lack of investment, because with, let's say, the Technology Modernization Fund, there's significant, opportunities to leverage that to improve performance. I really do think it comes down to leadership and setting expectations and holding people accountable for the performance against those expectations, and not setting unrealistic goals, recognizing we live in in an appropriated world, and that, in that process, has its bumps along the way. But I think, saying, in 2025, agencies should be at this point, and in 2030, they should be at that point, and then challenging ourselves to get to those goals.
Yeah. So, Dave, if you had one recommendation to offer, if you had the ear of leadership at OMB, and I'm sure you have those private conversations with Jason Miller, the DDM, and others. So I'm not asking you to breach any confidences here, but what one or two pieces of advice would you give them if you could be that influential to really drive forward and make the most of the next couple of years of this administration for progress in shared services?
Sometimes I probably am a bit impatient and maybe a little critical, but when we sort of reflect, though, John, back on the last almost 3 years now with the pandemic, and all of the impacts that the pandemic had, on our country, on our citizens, and around the world, I recognize that shared services wasn't the priority for the last 3 years. And I think, though, with the support of this administration and the Congress in continuing to invest in the Technology Modernization Fund, I think, again, it goes back to, let's set the expectations on where we want to be, not during the remaining 2.5 years of the current administration, but where do we want to be in 2030? What's the expectation? What's the gap between how we as a government use technology to address citizens' needs, and look at that in the comparison to our private lives and where industry has gone, and say, okay, what do I do over the next 8 years to close that gap?
Yeah. So we've been focusing mostly on the OMB side and the government, the executive branch side of things. What advice would you give to Congress? So if we haven't really had too much legislation in this particular area of shared services since the eGov Act, is there something Congress can do to help move the ball forward more rapidly?
I think there are, one is continuing to support the Technology Modernization Fund, and that's had its ups and downs. So I think continuing to invest in that infrastructure, because, the appropriators are challenged, where they get a finite amount of dollars to fund, on the discretionary side of government. Maybe there's a different way to look at technology investment for the federal government. And, while we have the TMF and that's, yielding some results already, maybe there needs to be a larger infrastructure bill, similar to what was just passed for physical infrastructure, right? For bridges and roads and things, and say, look, we're going to actually put aside this amount of money, for the next 20 years that will become, the infrastructure bill for technology modernization.
Hold on to that thought, Dave. I think we need to shop that around a little bit more. That's a really exciting one. I've been talking with Dave Mader. Dave is one of the most distinguished and dedicated leaders in the shared services movement for many, many years. And Dave, it's just a pleasure to have you share your reflections on the last 20 years or so of your career in moving forward from the eGov Act and implementing shared services. Thank you very much for your service, your leadership, and participating with us here in this conversation today.
Well, John, thank you. And also, your leadership in this field, going back to when I first met you in the beginning of the Obama administration, and not only the work that you do personally, but the work that the Shared Service Leadership Coalition does. I think actually has had significant impact on, progress that we've made thus far. So thank you as well.
Thank you, Dave. It's been a pleasure.